Hello Year 10, Miss Apps here. In today's lesson, we should be able to understand and explain how both the royal court and Elizabethan government functioned. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to focus in on this idea of the royal court and what it was, because it was both the building, the palaces, but also the people that surrounded Elizabeth and her government. So we're going to deconstruct that idea and get to know how the Elizabethan government worked a little bit better. Now, as per usual, can you make sure that you are writing down your titles? So today's title for the content that we're looking at today is Elizabethan England, the Royal Court. Okay, so let's deconstruct this idea of a royal court. The word court is a tricky one to define because in the Tudor period it can mean both a physical place but also a concept. So for example, you'll notice I have my picture there. That is Hampton Court. In early modern architecture, in Tudor architecture, a court was a square space, hence why we today would call badminton courts or tennis courts courts. So a court might be a palace, Hampton Court Palace. A court was also a place where you would go to meet the Queen. So if you were saying to somebody, I'm off to the royal court, you were going to the palace where Elizabeth was at that time. Now, remembering that Elizabeth has around 20 palaces, the court could be in lots of different places. The royal court was also, beyond just where the Queen lived, the centre of power. The Tudor period was a period of personal monarchy, personal politics. In the belief of the divine right of kings, it meant that Elizabeth I, all the power in the country flowed from her. So if you were going to the royal court, you would encounter there people called courtiers. The courtiers that surrounded Elizabeth were both her household staff, who looked after her on a day-to-day basis, but they were also her politicians, men like Sir William Cecil, who helped her run her government. So in a nutshell, courtiers, people who live with the Queen at her court, who look after her household, or who run the government. And on the other hand, the royal court, the place where the Queen is. To really understand the royal court, we need to understand some key concepts of Tudor life. So firstly, Tudor life was rigidly hierarchical. Everybody in society knew their place, from the nobility and the Queen at the very top of the hierarchy, down through the gentry, so the sirs, the knights, the yeomen, who had lots of land, were massive farmers, tenant farmers who rented their land, down to the labouring poor. They had no land and worked for wages, and at the very bottom, the vagrants and the homeless, the people who had no place to go to. And most of the population in this period lived in poverty. But if we are looking at the top today, we are looking at the royal court. So the royal court was made up of the nobility, also known as the nobles. These were people with titles like lord or lady, dukes, duchesses, earls, lords, sirs. These were the people of the court. You would only be allowed into the very centre of the court, the heart of the Queen's lands, the heart of the Queen's kingdom where she lived, if you were of a high status. The court then ran around two concepts. So firstly was the idea of patronage. You really need to understand this. So patronage is the idea of giving lands or titles to get people's loyalty. So if you did a good job for the Queen, like Sir William Cecil, who started off life as her secretary and then ended up being one of the key counsellors, advisors of her reign, she gave him many titles. So he went from Sir William Cecil to Lord Burleigh, which was a higher title, and it came with lots of land. So he then built this massive palace called Burleigh House. Courtiers would also give patronage. So the Queen would give patronage to her courtiers, titles, privileged jobs, and in the same way, the men at her court might do the same thing. So one of her favourites was the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, possibly her boyfriend, right? He might give courtiers lower than him jobs, influence with Elizabeth, etc., as a form of patronage to them. So it was a way of making sure that people had your back, had your favour. Okay? As part of this, faction also existed at court. So if I was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, I might give patronage to people at court. So I make sure that people who are a bit lower down than me have my back, are loyal to me. I might have given them a job in the Queen's household, or I might have used my influence to get them some money or get a court case in their local area swayed their way, for example. What I would then hope is Dudley, let's take for example the fact that Dudley really always wanted to go to war. He might therefore hope that in giving a load of courtiers favours, when he went to the Queen and pushed for war, they might also push her for it as well. So faction was when clusters of courtiers who kind of agreed on similar policies would cluster together, usually because they'd given each other patronage, and they would fight to influence the Queen. Now, there's some really key examples of this that we're going to understand. For example, William Cecil often has a faction around him that goes against Robert Dudley. They don't necessarily get along in the early years of her reign, but we'll look at that in more detail. So I'm going to now give you a really, really quick overview of government and the court and how it works. And over the coming weeks, we'll go into this in more detail. So if you get confused at any point, just stick with me, pause the video, play it back, take some notes maybe if you're struggling, but know also that we'll go over this in more detail. So if we think about the government and the courts, a good early modern monarch, so a good Tudor monarch, was the centre of all power. So they lived in a time of personal monarchy. So what the monarch said went, but they also had to be just and fair. They weren't dictators. The monarch led a lifestyle that meant they travelled around a host of castles and places in the south of England. We know this. They would also go off on progresses that we learnt about last week in the summer. So they would travel around with their court around these different palaces. The court, therefore, was the centre of government, and as wealth was seen to be a key indicator of status in the Tudor period, it had to be really magnificent and really generous. Courtiers, nobles who lived in the Queen's palaces and followed her around, would therefore expect to gain rewards and status from the Queen, as well as a small amount of wages and lavish food. So there were two different sections of the court: the household, which was supervised by the Lord Steward, and this looks after the daily needs of the Queen, courtiers and guests who were being entertained, whilst the chamber, which is slightly different, looked after the politics and government of the realm as well as finance, and this was led by a man called the Lord Chamberlain, who was essentially the head of the Elizabethan government. Members of the chamber were the most influential courtiers. In the time of her father, these courtiers had been male, and so would also have stayed with him, in his rooms and been part of his household. But in Elizabeth's time, this would have been improper. So Elizabeth's household is therefore populated by women, her ladies who look after her, and the politicians, the chamber, is made up of men, although the women still have influence. So the ladies in waiting who look after Elizabeth spend all their time with her, and they even sleep with her in her chamber at night. And this meant they could, if they wanted to, manipulate and push the Queen towards certain policies. Foreign ambassadors, for example, were known to try and bribe Elizabeth's ladies in waiting to try and get their ideas into her head. The Queen was also expected to rule with the Council of Advisors. She couldn't just rule by herself. She needed men to tell her not only what to do, but also to advise her on certain parts of policy, because she made the ultimate decisions in the country. So the council and privy councillors' jobs were to meet with the Queen, administer, look after the kingdom for her, and also make legal judgments. Traditionally, councillors were meant to come from either high positions in the church or in the nobility, and key councillors met in a group known as the Privy Council. The Privy Councillors were the most trusted of Elizabeth's advisors. They would discuss key issues and threats, and also have the responsibility for running different areas of the country and government. As part of this, below this, so most of the decisions come from the courts. They come from the men that live around Elizabeth, her privy councillors who advise her. However, there was also Parliament, but Parliament at this time was in no way as important as it is today. In fact, the Queen could largely ignore it if she wanted to. So Parliament had existed since the 13th century, but was very different to our Parliament today. First of all, it did not meet regularly at all. In fact, it was only called when Elizabeth really felt that she needed it. It was not central to government at all. You did not need Parliament to have decisions made or things done. Parliament was made up of the House of Lords, as it still is today, and these were the Lords Spiritual, so men from the church, like bishops and archbishops, and the Lords Temporal, so the lords who were nobles. And below this was the House of Commons, and the House of Commons was made up of 2 MPs for each county, borough, and the 2 universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Parliament had 3 roles: to pass laws which the Queen wanted passed anyway, to grant the Queen taxes in times of war and desperation, and to deal with local issues that would be passed up by the MPs in the local area. Under Elizabeth, Parliament met really, really rarely. She did not trust Parliament and thought giving her MPs too much opportunity to voice their opinion might cause some issues. And we'll look at this in more detail. Right, I've talked a lot, so I'm going to put you onto a task now. So in a second, you're going to pause this video and get on with it. So what I want you to do is open up the online textbook, and I want you to use page 10 and 11 to create a summary diagram of how the Elizabethan court works. And I've given you an idea of what that diagram might look like at the bottom of this slide. Once you finish with that, I want you to flip to page 12 to 13 and create a fact file of each key Privy Councillor. Include the titles they held, their importance to Elizabeth, key facts, their main roles, and their actions, and also their religious stance, but only if you can catch it. Please do not get stuck on a Privy Councillor if it doesn't mention his religion. That's no excuse to not do your work, okay? Okay, so all in all, that should have taken you about 15 to 20 minutes. The key takeaways that you really need to keep coming back to, and which are going to be the key examples that are going to answer so many questions, are these. Firstly, remember Sir Francis Walsingham, devout Puritan, hater of Catholics, and spymaster. He will come up again and again and again because he was intrinsic to the discovering of Catholic plots against Elizabeth from her excommunication in 1570 onwards, and he was also intrinsic to finding the evidence to allow for Elizabeth to execute her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who was her chief rival. In terms of faction, there are two that we need to understand. So firstly, there was the faction surrounding William Cecil and Robert Dudley. William Cecil had a group of courtiers around him who wanted to push Elizabeth to marry certain men, who wanted to make sure that Elizabeth did not go to war, and wanted to make sure that Elizabeth's religion was middle way. There was not too extremely Puritan, not too weakly Protestant. On the other hand, we have Robert Dudley. Robert Dudley, first of all, wants Elizabeth to marry him. He wants England to go to war, near on constantly. He's a soldier. And finally, he's a Puritan. So he really wants religious changes to be pushed further. So throughout the reign of Elizabeth, we're going to see these two men and the courtiers around them fight in this idea of faction. Once William Cecil and Robert Dudley die, because Elizabeth's reign is super long, we then have a new faction come about. So Robert Devereux, who is Robert Dudley's stepson, who's also known as the Earl of Essex, then comes to lead his own faction against William Cecil's son, Robert Cecil. Okay, so two main factions, William Cecil versus Robert Dudley, and then Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, versus Robert Cecil. Can you make sure that you've got that written down in your book? Because that's really important. We'll keep coming back to that. Right, firstly, I just want to apologise if you can hear my cat running about. She's going a bit nutty. Final thing that we are going to do today is we're going to watch the absolute don of Tudor history, Dr. David Starkey, discuss the early years of Elizabeth's reign. So this will kind of take up your second lesson today, just watching this video. So I want you to watch this documentary, and then I want you to answer these questions in your book in full sentences. So why was a lone female queen an issue in Tudor England? What were the different roles of a married king and queen? Why was Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley, so controversial? What was Elizabeth's attitude towards marriage? What did she claim she'd happy to die as in 1559? What was Elizabeth's religious policy called? What happened to Thomas Watson, Bishop of Lincoln, for standing against her religious policies in 1559? What happened to Elizabeth in October 1562? And what would have happened if she had died? Why was Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, such a threat? And finally, how did Mary Queen of Scots come to be in England? Now, when you're answering that question, there is a detailed story. You're going to need to bring in some marriages into that. And she doesn't only get married once, she gets married 3 times. Okay? All right, well done, boys. I'm going to expect this work to be emailed to me after half term. So I'll give you a date by which you should have this done. Next time I teach you after half term, some of you are going to start coming in with me on a week by week basis, and you'll find out who you are and when. But after half term, what we'll work towards is a longer source answer on faction. Stay safe.